Let's go over number 1252, cells with values in a matrix. Given n, m, m, which are the dimensions of matrix initialized by zeros. So n represents row, and m is columns. And we're gonna initialize our matrix by filling them with zeros. Given an array of indices where indices at index I is row at index I and column at index I. For each pair of row and column, you have to increment all cells in row at index I and column at index I by 1. So whatever our given indices is, we have to increase the rows or columns by 1. And return the number of cells with odd values in the matrix after applying increment to all indices. So after we perform this first instruction, we want to find the odd numbers in our matrix. So if we look at our example 1, we have n is equal to 2, m is 3, right? So that means row is 2 and our columns is 3. And we're given our indices. So working with example 1, so this is our matrix. First thing we actually have to know is this is the rows and this is columns. And we're gonna initialize it with 0, right? So we fill everything with 0. And this is index 0, this is index 1, this is 0, 1, and 2. Okay. And if we look at our indices array, we have to, for the first one, when I is equal to 0, our first indices is going to be 0 and 1. And remember that the first value is row and second is column. Now, the first operation that we have to do is we're given our indices. Row is 0, right? And we want to increase all the numbers in our row by 1. So our row 0 is over here. So r is equal to 0. We're going to increase row 0 by 1 for all elements and keep the columns. And column is 1. So we're given our array. And column 1 is over here, and we want to increase all the values in column 1 by 1. So we're gonna get 1, 2, 1 and 0, 1, 0. Now when I is equal to 2, our index is 1 and 1. And again, this is row and this is column. Now we want to increase our row 1 by 1. So our row 1 is this over here. So our matrix is going to look like 1, 2, 1 and 1, 2, 1. And now we want to increase our column. Our column is equal to 1, which is this column. So if we increase that column by 1, we're going to get 1, 3, 1 and 1, 3, 1. So now we're done with our loop for making our matrix. And this is our final. And now the second step of the problem, we want to find the number of odd numbers, right? So we want to go through this matrix and then find number of odd numbers. And if we count all the odd numbers, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So odds equals 6. If we check our result, we get 6. And if you look at the explanation of our final matrix was 1, 3, 1 and 1, 3, 1, which we got over here. If you guys find this helpful, make sure you guys like and subscribe. Thanks. Alright, now let's code our solution. So first thing we do, make our function. We declare our function, which takes in three parameters: row, column, and array of arrays, which is our indices. And I'm going to make two variables. Let count is equal to 0. This is going to count number of odd numbers in our matrix. And next one is our matrix itself. And I'll use array from to initialize our matrix. This is going to have a length of n, which is our rows, and array from length of m, which is our columns, and we're gonna fill our array with 0. Okay. If we return our matrix, you can see that we have a matrix over here. So this is row 0 and this is row 1. So column, this is column 1, column 0, column 1, and column 2. And now we want to iterate through our indices so that we can increase our values at a given index. I'll use a for loop. So we have for const r, this is row, column of indices. Okay. So we're iterating through our indices, and I'm using array destructuring. So r is going to represent 0 and 1. C, which is our column, is going to represent 1 and 1. Okay. And now we want to update our columns. Update columns. And later we want to obviously update our rows. All right. So in order for us to update our columns, we want to use for loop again. So for let I is equal to 0, I is less than m, and we want to increment each time. And we're going to get our matrix at index I and update our column, right? And increment by 1. So what we did here was we're using for loop. And remember, we have two rows, right? So we do I is less than n. And for this matrix at index I is going to represent our row. And we're increasing our column at C. And this is how we are updating our columns. And now we want to do the same for our rows. So for let I is equal to 0, I is gonna be less than m this time, which is our rows, columns, and increment by 1. But this time it's going to be matrix at index R and increment I. So we're getting our row to increase at index R and incrementing all the items in the row, which is going to be 0, 1, and 2, as in the index, and increment all our numbers. And if we check our matrix, we got 131 and 131. And if you remember, this is the matrix that we want to get. And we're not actually done here yet because we want to find number of odd cells. So we have an array of arrays, and we want to go through all the items or all the numbers in the arrays. So we obviously need a nested loop, but this time I'll just use a nested for each, just for change. So matrix, we're iterating through our matrix array. So for each array, I want to iterate through the array again. So for each, and for each current value, which is our number, if current value is divisible by 2, well, if it's not divisible by 2, I want to increase our count variable by 1, and if not, I'll just do nothing. I'll return null. And if I return my count variable, I get 6 and 0. So if you remember, our first one is 131 and 131. They're all odd values, so we get an output of 6. And for the second one, we have our matrix of this, and none of them are odd numbers, right? So we get 0. And if we check our results again, we have 6 and 0. So that's our solution. So I'll make another note, iterate through our matrix and get number of odds. Okay, let's go over our code one more time just to get a better understanding. So our function has 3 parameters, row, column, and indices, which is an array of arrays, and made 2 variables. So count is going to count number of odds, and matrix is going to make our first matrix. And if we're using example 2, we have 2 by 2 matrix. So our matrix is 2 by 2, meaning 0, 0, and 0, 0. And this is col, and this is row. And we want to iterate through our indices, which is, our indices is 1 and 1, and 0 and 0. Remember, this is row, column, column. And we use array distinguishing to designate the first one as row and second one as column. And now we want to update our columns and our rows. So what we have to do is we have to iterate through our matrix. So let's say that I is equal to 0 and our indices is 1 and 1. And our original matrix is going to look something like 0 and 0, 0 and 0, right? Okay. Now they want us to increase row 1 and column 1. So let's start with our row first. Actually, let's start with our column first because that's what we're doing over here. So when C is equal to 1, and remember column is over here, right? This one. What we do is 0 and 1, we increase by 1, 0 and 1. So what we're doing is we're getting matrix at index I, the first one, increasing our column 1 by 1, and we're getting our matrix 2, matrix at index 1 actually, and we're increasing our column, which is this, by 1, and this is what we get. And now we want to increase our row, and when R is going to be 1, right? So we're done with our columns, and we want to increase our row 1. So we have our updated column, and row 1 is this one over here, right? This is row 0. So we keep row 0 and we increase our row 1 by 1 for all items. So this is going to be 1 and this is going to be 2. So matrix index R is going to give us, so R was 1, so this one, and then we increase all elements by 1. So now we're done with our first loop. And when I is equal to 1, or actually our second iteration, our index is 0 and 0, and our array is, or our matrix is 0, 1, and 1 and 2. And now they want us to increase column at index 0. So column at index 0 is this over here, the first ones. So if we increase those by 1, it's going to be 1 and 1 and 2 and 2. And now we want to increase our row, which is 0 again. And our first row is this one. And if we increase all elements by 1, we get 2 and 2 and 2 and 2. So this is our final matrix. So we have our matrix as 2, 2, 2, and 2. Okay. Now that we have our matrix, we want to iterate through our matrix and get number of odd numbers, right? And from just by looking at it, we don't have odds. So first thing we do is we go to each array. So the first array is going to be 2 and 2, and array is going to be this. And we check, is the current value for the first one, is it divisible by 2? Well, we actually use the current value divisible by 2. Mod 2 is it going to return, is it not going to return 0? And if it's not, so if it's 1, it's going to increase our count variable. And if it's even, so if this is odd, this is even. So if it's odd, it's going to increase our count. If it's not, it's just going to be null. And in this case, it's obviously going to be null, right? Because 2 mod 2 is going to be equal to 0. And we want a number that's not going to be equal to 0. So we don't increase our count. And we do this for all the numbers in our array. And none of them are odds. So what we do is we just return null. And when we're done with our iteration, we return our count, which is 0.